Okay, let's get started. I hope everything went well last week with the guest lecturers, Nick and Sam. Thank you for being patient with me being away. I always bribe my students when I return. I was in New Mexico. New Mexico is not necessarily known for their chocolate, but they are known for their chili. So if you're not quite awake this morning, you will be. Break off a section and pass it along. There are no nuts in these, but it says it was made in a factory that also processes nuts. So if you have any nut allergies, I'm afraid you're out of luck this morning. Okay. There is your requisite bribe for me being away. Let's reorient back to HCI. We are going to start in today on our next theme on looking outward. So we've spent a lot of time talking about design. You've seen a little bit of the ins and outs of what goes on between your ears and which aspects of that are relevant for HCI. It's a fantastic time to be studying HCI. For those of you that get a job in creating interfaces or apps or autonomous cars, it's a great time to be working in this area because as a society, we're in the midst of basically threading computation into everything, right? Into the outside world and connecting people together, physical objects together, different species together, in lots and lots of interesting ways and potentially dangerous ways. So again, an interesting time to be working in HCI. So in this theme on looking outward, we're going to sort of start as a starting point with the traditional person working with their laptop or a person interacting with their phone, one person, one machine in a pretty controlled environment. What happens when we start to complicate that HCI loop that we looked at the beginning of the semester, right? You make a prediction about what you think the machine is going to do. You perform an action. You push against the machine. The machine receives that as input, cogitates, thinks, provides some feedback. You observe the result of your interaction with the machine. Its result matches your prediction or it doesn't, which influences what you do next. And around you go, right? What happens when we start to add more and more people and more machines into that interactive loop? How does that change our thinking about HCI? So that's what we mean by sort of looking outward. We're going to move beyond this standard one person, one machine, real-time feedback loop. So we'll start today by looking at crowdsourcing, where we're going to assume more and more people working with more and more machines to tackle a problem which would be difficult or impossible for one person to perform on their own, or one machine to perform on its own, or one person and one machine to perform together. We need lots of people, or as many people as possible, and as many machines as possible. Okay, so that's today, crowdsourcing. Tomorrow night you have deliverable 7 due. Let's just take a moment now and talk about deliverable 7 since I wasn't here last week and didn't have a chance to. Any questions about deliverable 7? As was already pointed out this morning, this one is a little bit challenging because matplotlib was not really designed to create GUIs. It's not ideal. We're just looking to see that you do the best you can. Some students in previous years have abandoned matplotlib at this point and switched over to Pygame. If you want to do that, that's fine, but the TA and myself are not Pygame experts. So if you switch over to Pygame and you run into trouble, Stack Overflow is going to become your best friend because we will not be able to help you at that point. You don't need to make that decision this week. If you're able to push on with matplotlib and things work, that's fine. But in a few weeks from now, if things start to become particularly hacky in matplotlib, you can always consider moving over to something else. Doesn't really matter to us. Any other questions? Yes?
After completing deliverable
6,
is it expected that our leap motion program is not going to be very good at predicting what numbers?
Okay, so deliverable 6 is also challenging, right? Because you're pulling in data from lots of different people. Let's talk about that for a moment. It was also pointed out that not all of the data sets in the deliverable 6 zip file are in the same format. But we have a large enough class here that there is plenty of redundancy. You should be able to find clean data for all of the 10 digits. We don't expect that your system will recognize all signs perfectly, but it should be able to do significantly better than chance, right? That's really what we're looking for, right? It might make a few mistakes. If you go back and watch my video from deliverable 6, it's not perfect either. We're just looking for it to do pretty well, right? That's the idea. One of the challenges as you push on towards the end of the deliverables is what do you do with your user when it's the KNN algorithm making the mistake, right? We talked about this when we were talking about the gulf of execution, the gulf of evaluation. What happens if the user thinks that they're signing the digit 3 and the system keeps saying, no, 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 that's the digit 4. I asked you to sign the digit 3. Is it the person making the mistake? Is it the user? Is it KNN? How do you know? How might you help the user get over that hump to figure out what they should be doing next? They think they're doing the right thing and the system is telling them they're not. Those are the sorts of things that we're looking to see you tackle in this class, not creating a perfect KNN algorithm. Yes, Margaret.
What is allowed as far as really, like, for instance, if you were to take a picture of things that you want them to do, like your Hanover,
Yep.
allowed?
That's absolutely, no, that's perfectly fine. What's cheating is a huge paragraph of English text, right? If you want to take a photograph of your own hand, digitize it as a PNG or whatever it is that Matplotlib recognizes and pull that in and show that photograph, that is perfectly acceptable, no problem. Okay. Whatever you want to do visually to help the user figure out what they should be doing, that's fair game. Any other questions about deliverable 6 or deliverable 7? No? Okay. All right, so on Thursday we will talk about deliverable 8 and we'll carry on from there. Just a reminder, the deliverables are now due Wednesday night and we talk about the new deliverable on Thursday. All good? Okay, let's talk a little bit about crowdsourcing. This is a relatively newcomer to the field of HCI, but it's relatively, by this point, sort of intuitive, right? There's lots of tasks out there that are particularly difficult for computers to solve. So we want to try and recruit people to help with that, with those tasks. And I've organized the slides today in a somewhat historical order. One of the very first crowdsourcing applications was SETI at Home back in '99. Has anybody seen this before? Few people? Okay. So this was a project to basically recruit as much computation as possible to help sift through vast amounts of radio data collected by radio telescopes around the globe to look for little green men. SETI stands for the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. Back in 1999, there wasn't a lot of computation out there. The search for life or intelligence beyond the Earth seemed to be something that was compelling to a lot of people. And the idea was you might be able to convince people to give up some of their spare CPU cycles to help look for intelligent signals hidden in radio data collected here on Earth. You can go and read about SETI at Home now. It's been running continuously for about 19 years, and there's been a spectacular number of people in computation thrown at this problem. It's a relatively straightforward idea. There isn't much that you need to do other than download and install and run the SETI at Home application on your laptop or desktop. Some of the crowdsourcing applications we're going to see today, the participants are more or less passive. All they're doing is contributing compute, but not cognition. You don't need to go looking for signals in this radio data for intelligence. There is a machine learning algorithm that's doing it for you. All SETI at Home needs is your spare CPU cycles. Okay. So that was a project created originally at Berkeley, and the Berkeley team then generalized this into the Berkeley Open Infrastructure for Network Computing, or BOINC application. This is sort of a general system where now if you're a scientist, you can actually try and take your research code and write it in the BOINC format and then include it in the portfolio here. And then a user who downloads this application and runs it on the machine, they get a menu of possible scientific projects and they can decide how many and which they want to contribute computation to. It's interesting to go and browse the BOINC website and look at all the different scientific projects that are there and which ones most people tend to choose and contribute computation to. Has anyone used BOINC before? A couple people. What are some of the popular projects?
Folding at home.
Folding at home. And we're going to talk about folding at home in a moment. As you would imagine, a lot of the applications that people tend to volunteer computation for medical applications, medical domains, exciting things like SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. One of the advantages of crowdsourcing when done well is you can attract large numbers of people and therefore their computers, but you have to incentivize them in the right way, right? It has to be something that people want to volunteer computation for. So if you, as a researcher, decide to try and create a crowdsourcing application, you have to think very carefully about the incentives. Why would somebody want to volunteer or contribute computation to your project, right? So something we touched on when we talked about packed analysis. We're now not just thinking about protein folding or searching for little green men, we're thinking about people, right? Why would somebody want to contribute to this project? Sort of an interesting thing to think about in the crowdsourcing domain. Okay, folding at home, one of the most popular crowdsourcing applications out there. The protein folding problem is a very hard problem and a very important problem. If you'll remember from your biology class, a protein is basically a string of peptides. So you have a one-dimensional list of these peptides. If you want to try and visualize them, you can imagine different peptides as different colors. Once a protein is constructed, it will gradually start to fold into a three-dimensional shape. And depending on the number and distribution of peptides along this one-dimensional string, some of them attract one another, some of them repel one another in a very, very complicated manner. But one of the most fascinating things about polypeptides is that given enough time, they will conform or fold up into one and only one three-dimensional shape. Now, it depends on how you heat them and what's going on, but generally, for every single, if you have a one-dimensional configuration, there is a corresponding three-dimensional shape of that folded protein. And the 3D shape of a protein dictates its function. So in a lot of medical domains where the idea is to try and design a protein or alter an existing protein to improve or degrade its given function, the idea is to come up with the right sequence of peptides that will fold into the right shape to give you whatever function you want. It turns out that predicting the 3D shape from the sequence of peptides is a hard problem. It's an NP hard problem. There's no good way to do this except to simulate it. And even when you simulate it, it's not always possible to simulate the way in which it will fold to get that final shape. So the protein folding problem is given a sequence of peptides, how should it be folded to reach that final 3D shape that it would eventually reach with enough shaking and heating and cooling and so on. That's the problem. So some teams that were inspired by the SETI at Home project created the Folding at Home project, which was again a screensaver. So it was a passive crowdsourcing project. You downloaded the Folding at Home application, you started it up, and you got these cool visualizations of strings of different colored beads gradually folding up into a three-dimensional shape. It was extremely successful. This came from Berkeley, the same Berkeley team, and since 2000, they've written 139 research papers based on the data generated from this application. So the tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people by now that have contributed to this, generated enough data to help the Berkeley team understand how a vast array of proteins actually fold into their 3D conformation. Question?
So you're showing examples from like 1999, 2000?
Yes.
Now with like, I don't know, at what point does it become more difficult to crowdsource versus just go to like a service, someone who has a supercomputer?
Good question.
Do this with?
Absolutely. So that's a great question, right? So this is all pre-cloud, right? Today, if the only thing you wanted to do was to attract a huge amount of compute, which is what the SETI at Home project and the Folding at Home project wanted to do, you probably wouldn't create a screensaver. You would go to the cloud, which works for some things. If you're the Berkeley research team, you might have enough money to buy enough time on the cloud to do the amount of computation required to generate enough data to produce these 139 research papers. Not every research group would be rich enough to be able to do that. But that's a good question, right? Today, you probably go to the cloud rather than the screensaver. Assuming that your crowdsourcing application does not require anything from the users other than compute, right? These are, what we're looking at the moment are passive crowdsourcing projects, right? Start up the screensaver, sit back, relax, and just let your computer do what it does, right? So yes, there are many people that are downloading, installing, and running these crowdsource applications, but if you think about it from an HCI point of view, you have thousands of computers and 0 people. People are not really in the loop of this project in a meaningful way, right? Other than downloading, installing, and running. We're going to switch in a moment and start to look at active crowdsourcing projects where what you're recruiting from the crowd is not just their compute, but their cognition. They're going to play an active role in the research project itself. Yes?
Is there any incentive in downloading these programs and running?
Good question. Is there? Oh, we had one person who said they use the Boink application, so not that much. There certainly was back in the early 2000s, because this was an amazing thing at the time. There was no cloud. You could actually participate in the search for little green men or helping to fold proteins, many of which were discovered in these 139 research projects that are helping with health applications, that are actually solving or combating disease. So you could be an active player, at least your computer could be an active player in something that was important to you. But not too many of you run these anymore, right? So maybe the incentive isn't really there anymore. So maybe the novelty is kind of worn off. Back in the early 2000s, when Folding at Home was getting started, obviously one of the things you're going to have to do if you create one of these crowdsourcing applications is have some good eye candy, right? It has to be showing you something that's interesting. So they had this relatively intuitive interface where you'd see at the beginning one long string of different colored balls, and then it would gradually start to fold up into this 3-dimensional shape. The Berkeley team started to get a whole bunch of emails from people running the Folding at Home project saying, I don't know what your algorithm is doing, but it's not very good. I saw one of your proteins fold up and there was a big hollow piece in the middle. I know that it's missing the correct conformation. So the idea is that when you have a protein that's folding, it usually folds into a compact shape. So if you watch one of these polypeptides snarl up on its own, the human visual system, again, we are visual creatures, we're very good at visual pattern recognition. Without knowing much about protein physics, you can often see that this is not the final 3-dimensional shape, that the computer is getting stuck in a suboptimal solution. Your KNN algorithm often does this as well. It mistakes one digit for another. Most machine learning algorithms have this problem where they're searching for a solution and they often find a solution that's good enough, and they sort of focus on that solution and they miss the real optimal solution that's out here that they can't see. But it turns out that given this visualization, even casual users of the Folding at Home project could see the computer was stuck on a suboptimal solution. So people started emailing the Berkeley team and saying, can you please add an interface where I can reach in and shake or untwist and then retwist some of these proteins so that I can help you solve your problem? I know how to do it better than your algorithm does. So after enough emails, they created the Foldit game. So now we've switched from crowdsourcing to gamification, right? So now we have the first of many now active crowdsourcing projects, where now the crowd is being recruited not just for compute, but for cognition. You can go and download and play Fold It yourself. You could probably guess what the game is. You're presented with one long string at the beginning, and then you're given a whole bunch of little atomic actions that you can perform down here. You can grab a piece of the string and twist it or bend it at a particular point. You can shake or wiggle different parts, which is sort of a metaphor for adding a little bit of energy and allowing it to conform into a tighter three-dimensional configuration. And you get points when you get to the right shape. But remember, the game is that we don't know what the right shape is. So if you're the designer of the Fold It game, how do you award points? How do you know when the user has gotten to the right shape?
Well, you said that proteins compact tightly.
Yep.
So maybe you could use that information, like you know that it starts out as a string and all of the points are kind of far away. So if you end up with all the points close together, then maybe you know.
Absolutely, right? So you're trying to incentivize the crowd to do something. What are you trying to get them to do? Solve the protein folding problem. What do we know about the protein folding problem is we're looking for the most compact three-dimensional shape you can get from a given protein. So award more points the more a compact solution a given user finds, right? If you find the most compact three-dimensional shape so far, you win. You're at the top of the leaderboard. If I come along and play the same protein that you were playing, and I discover an even more compact solution, now I'm at the top of the leaderboard, and so on and so forth. Right? So gamification, slightly different from crowdsourcing. We want to incentivize people to not just perform visual recognition tasks, but to appeal to people's instinctual puzzle-solving instinct, right? Help them try and figure out how to solve this puzzle. So that's gamification. Back in 2008, let's just step back a few years ago. Here was another early internet game called the ESP Game. Has anybody heard of the ESP Game? It was quite famous about 10 years ago for a very good reason. Back then, the internet was just starting to collect large numbers of photographs and not a lot of video at that point, but it was just starting. And all of those images did not yet have tags associated with it, right? It seems kind of obvious today. Most images you post on Facebook, faces get tagged, you can tag things in the images. But the internet in 2004 had a very growing store of images for which there were no labels. The machine learning revolution hadn't happened yet, so machines couldn't add labels to images. But obviously, we knew that most of the photographs out there on the internet had interesting objects in them. How could we go about tagging or labeling the vast number of photographs and images that were being aggregated on the internet? Luis van Aan at Carnegie Mellon University came up with a way to do this, which was to turn it into a game. And there were many of these games. The most famous one was the ESP Game. So you play this in pairs. You log into the ESP Game website, and you'd be randomly paired up with some other user on the web, and you would both be shown the same image, and you would be asked to just type in words that describe what you see in the image. And the game is not just a visual recognition task, not just to figure out what's in the image, but it's also a social cognition task. The game is to figure out not just what's in the image, but what you think the other person is going to say is in the image. That's the ESP part. So you get points the quicker the two of you type in the same word describing something that's in that image. Make sense? So why go to that effort to do this in pairs? Why not just have an individual write words and have those words be associated with that image?
Because if you have two people, it's harder for someone to sabotage the effort.
Absolutely, right? So if I'm on my own, I might make up arbitrary bad words and have them be associated with as many images as possible. But if there are two of us playing the game, harder to cheat, right? A lot of the crowdsourcing and gamification applications that are out there now have this sort of social component in it where there's either implicit or explicit pressure against cheating, right? There's some sort of consensus that needs to be reached. So the initial set of images out there on the internet gradually attracted tags. So the more people that said a particular word when they saw a particular image, that word became associated with that image. And we had a growing data set on the internet of images and mostly English language words associated with them. Once you had that growing training set, now machine learning algorithms could take over. They could start to look at the images and predict what words or what things exist in that image, right? Think about the deliverable 6 data set, right? You have a whole bunch of, in your case, gesture data, not image data. And instead of English language words associated with them, you have the digit 0, the digit 1, and so on, right? You need that labeled training set, the raw data and the label associated with it. And if you have enough of those raw data sets and labels, then a machine learning algorithm can start to learn relationships between the data and how to predict the label. So the ESP game sort of laid a lot of the foundation for the deep learning revolution that started in 2006, 2007, and got us to where we are today. Okay. In 2009, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, released the Network Challenge, which became renamed by everyone who participated in it as the Red Balloon Challenge. DARPA is the research wing of the US Department of Defense. What DARPA was interested in 2009 was this growing set of crowdsourcing and gamified applications out there on the web. And DARPA wondered whether you could create some of these games to help with what DARPA referred to as highly distributed, time-sensitive problems. You can imagine for a Department of Defense why that's important. There might be a very large catastrophe, wide scale, where you need to identify or find human survivors, for example. You might need to coordinate FEMA, for example, after a large-scale disaster. You need to identify things that are very far apart after a communications network has gone down or there are problems over a very wide area, and you need to do it quickly. So wide-scale distribution and time-sensitive. DARPA's question was, could you make a game out of this? Could you recruit large numbers of non-experts to help with whatever this task happens to be? Let's say, for example, you need to identify or find people that have first aid skills in every major city in the United States within an hour. How would you possibly go about solving that task? So in order to investigate that, DARPA made the Red Balloon Challenge on, I forget the date, but it was in 2009, and it was they picked the day that was the 40th anniversary of the internet. So DARPA is usually credited with helping to finance and get the first internet up and running, which was the ARPANET. At that point, it was made up of 4 computers in Southern California. So 40 years later, DARPA said, we incentivized some people back in the late 60s to create what became known as the internet. Let's try and do it again. In this case, on a particular day in 2009, DARPA put up 10 10-foot balloons, so they're about yay big, and they placed them at 10 undisclosed locations in the continental United States. This is where they were actually deployed. DARPA advertised that they were going to do this 1 month before they launched the balloons. And they promised that they would award the winning team $40,000. So whoever could find the 10, or report on the GPS locations of these 10 balloons would get the $40,000. If you were the second team to identify all 10 balloons, you got, okay, so all or nothing game. Pretty tricky. When DARPA designed this task, they advertised that they would put up the balloons for 12 hours on the first day, and if nobody found the balloons, they put them up for 12 hours again the following day in the same location, and they do that every day for a week. Somebody found all 10 balloons, great. If not, no one got the prize. Has anybody heard of this challenge before? If you have, don't give away the answer. Yes, question. The purpose is to see whether you could incentivize as large a group of people as possible to perform a distributed search task as quickly as possible. So find 10 balloons in a week, find first aid experts in every major city, that sort of thing, right? Something has gone wrong and you need to find people or things that are largely distributed in a very short period of time. Clearly, those kinds of tasks are not going to be solved by one person. They're not going to be solved by 10 people. They're probably not going to be solved by 100 people, right? So whatever your crowdsourcing or gamified solution is to solve this problem, you're going to have to try and incentivize a very large number of people to perform this task. Not an easy thing to do. Okay, so on the first day, DARPA put up these 10 balloons, and within 9 hours, a team from MIT came back with 10 GPS coordinates, and all 10 of those GPS coordinates were correct. They found all 10 balloons in 9 hours. How is this possible? Again, if you know of the red balloon challenge, don't give it away.
What if you offered $1,000 to someone who gave you the location of one of the balloons?
Okay, so we have our first proposal for a solution, which is we're going to give $1,000 to everybody who finds a balloon. So remember that you got $40,000. So assuming that 10 people find 10 balloons, you give away $10,000 and keep $30,000 for yourself. Any other proposals?
Turn it into a game somehow.
Turn it into a game somehow? Okay, so let's say you post your particular solution for a moment. It's kind of a game. If I find the balloon, I get $10,000. I don't know anything. Let's go back to 2009. I don't know anything about DARPA or red balloons or anything. I'm cruising around the web and I find your advertisement that if I find a balloon, I get $10,000. I say, what is this red balloon challenge? I go and read about it. I'm told that there are 10 balloons anywhere in the United States. Am I incentivized to go looking for a balloon? If I find it, I'm going to get $1,000.
No, but if enough people stumble upon them, then
Possibly. If enough people stumble
they have
on
to
it,
know about it.
maybe, right? So you need to put yourself in the mind, not of the team members, the person that wants to win the challenge, but the person that finds your advertisement. My chance of finding one of these red balloons is probably less than going out and buying 1,000 lottery tickets and hoping for the best. It's a good start. What else could we do?
It's hard to say for 2009, but especially today, like using social media, people would post a picture of a 10 by 10 foot red balloon.
I think exactly. Today, this might not make sense, right? Within a very short period of time, somebody says there's some weird 10-foot balloon just outside my town. Task could be solved pretty quickly. Not back in 2009.
Use pre-existing networks like alumni.
Possibly. Okay, so you're at UVM or at MIT. You ask all the alumni to do this. What is the chance that there are enough UVM alumni or MIT alums in these 10 cities that they're going to, first of all, find your website and find a balloon and send you the GPS coordinates?
Well, because like you have a list to contact all the alumni.
You do. Let's say you have a list. You have the phone number and email address of every single UVM alumni that's still alive. Still not a pretty good chance, right? This is actually a pretty hard problem when you really start to think about it. Other ideas? What else can we do?
Well, sort of on that same tack, there's police and rescue networks all over the place.
Okay.
And they are constantly looking around.
So you could,
So
yep.
maybe not in this application, but
Right.
in a more.
That's true. Maybe not in this case. There are, of course, existing networks that are always searching and surveying for odd things like 10-foot balloons that weren't there the day before, possibly. But again, even those extensive networks, can we rely on them to find all 10 balloons? You got to find all 10 or else you're not going to get the 40,000.
Did they hack DARPA to find location?
They did not. Well, as far as I know, they did not hack DARPA. Maybe that's the real story. So you're all now becoming experts in HCI, right? So you need to put yourself in the shoes of the searchers, right? So if you tell me I'm going to get $1,000 or even $10,000 if I find a balloon, what am I going to think about that, right? My chances of finding the balloon are extremely low. So what are you could try and incentivize me to find a balloon. You could offer me a cash reward to find the balloon. What else could you incentivize me to do other than find a balloon, which is a low probability event, Arlo?
something with the airport, it might be a lot less effort for people to actually go looking. They can just peer out their window and see if they see a big red thing.
If they're at the airport?
If the posters are at the airport.
Okay.
You have posters instead of the website, and then you, yeah.
Possibly. Yeah, maybe.
Could you ask folks to like post on their social media platforms? Like find like everyone look for these balloons.
So there you go, right? So could you incentivize somebody not to find a balloon, but to forward the advertisement for your team to find the balloons? Maybe. So I have, I forget now, a couple thousand followers on Twitter. If I know you, maybe I'll do it as a favor to you to forward it, but I could do it, but how would you incentivize me to do it, right? I got a lot of emails when I get back to my office. Do I want to also spend 5 or 10 minutes forwarding your ad about some red balloon challenge? How would you incentivize me to forward your advertisement?
Have you ever heard of those scary text messages that go around that say like, you'll get a kiss from your crush?
I am not familiar with those, no. I guess I'm on the right carrier, right?
It's like forward these or else you'll die.
Oh, forward these or else you'll die. Those I know, right? Yeah, exactly. We're getting closer now, actually, or maybe not the negative incentive. Remember that in all these crowdsourcing and gamification applications, the key is kind of social engineering, which is a part of HCI, right? How do you incentivize people to do things, and what are you incentivizing them to do?
If you have some sort of like website that said if you enter your email address and then like a certain amount of other email addresses,
Yep.
like then you'll get like a certain monetary compensation, and
Ah.
that will turn forward like a search email to all people.
Okay, so if I type in my email address and the email addresses of 5 of my friends, you'll give me some financial compensation. Okay, now we're getting closer, right? So I may not find the balloon, but I do have 5 friends and I know their 5 email addresses. That's easy enough to do. So let's try and drill down on that solution for a little bit.
If one of the people you recommended finds the balloon, then you get a piece of it.
Now we're getting close, right? So I might get a little bit of a financial reward if I give you my 5 email addresses, but what I really want money for is one of my friends to find the balloon, and that friend, you can tell that I invited that friend, right? The chance that I'm going to find the balloon is close to 0. The chance that my 5 friends might find the balloons are also pretty low, but slightly higher. If they invite 5 of their friends, now we're at 25 plus 5, if we assume no overlap. We now have 30 people plus 1. We have 31 people on your team looking for the balloons. Now we're getting closer. There's still a problem here, though. If you financially incentivize people, if you promise them money for forwarding on email addresses, what happens if you get 40,000 email addresses back, right? Your 5 friends give you 5 email addresses of their 5 friends, and they give you 5 email addresses. How are you going to give money to everyone, right? This could turn into a runaway process where you've promised more money than you have to give.
What if you only give in like percentages of the project fee? So, like, you know, if like one of the people you recommend like finds it, then you get like a cut of that money.
There you go, right? So you want to incentivize me not just to invite my friends, but to invite the friends that I think have a good chance of finding the balloon, or recursively, I'm incentivized to invite my friends who I think will be incentivized to invite their friends who will find the balloon, right? And we promise a cut of the 40,000 to whoever finds the balloon, whoever invited the person that found the balloon, whoever invited the person who found the balloon, and all the way back to you, the team member. Right? That is exactly what the MIT team did. They used a recursive incentivization strategy, and if you mentally put a shape around this tree, you get a pyramid. Recursive incentivization strategy is also known as a pyramid scheme. All right. This is the internet age version of the pyramid scheme, right? So the MIT team put up a website They promised to give $2,000. Remember, you got $40,000 in total. They promised to give $2,000 in total to anyone that found the balloon. If you invited the person that found the balloon, such as Carol in this example, Carol gets half of the $2,000, right? If Bob invited Carol, Bob gets half of that, 500, and all the way back to whoever was the originating node. So if you take any branch in this tree, or any successful branch in this team, where someone at a leaf node found the tree, and you trace all the way back to the root, what's the sum of money that needs to be given out for that branch?
$4,000.
It's always going to approach 4,000, but never reach it. And there's a proof in the paper from the MIT team, but I think it's pretty obvious, right? So in this case, in this branch, we have 3,000, 3,500 plus 250, 3,750, which leaves a remaining 250 that wasn't given out for that particular search branch. That the MIT team just gave that to charity. The right-hand branch there, that branch cost the MIT team $3,500. The remaining $500 they gave to charity. Okay, so a brilliant strategy, and also brilliant from an HCI point of view, because algorithmically, this is a pretty simple algorithm, not very complicated, but it was very clever in thinking about the people involved in this process, right? Incentivizing people in the right way. There was a financial incentive. That's good, right? That one's easy, but what are you financially incentivizing someone to do? Okay, you can go and have a look at the science paper that the MIT team published with the details of their result. Here's 3 search trees that resulted. The one in the top here, this led to an actual successful discovery of a balloon. This person down here found a balloon. This person was invited by this person. And this person, along with a whole bunch of other people, was invited by this person. I don't know who this person was, but they seem to be very popular on social media. Here's another person who found the MIT page, and they invited their friends, and this friend invited these friends, and so on. None of them found a balloon, but there you can still see the percolation of advertisements being sent out. So this recursive incentivization process is incentivizing people not just to search for balloons, but to invite their friends to the process. Okay. So that's why we're talking about crowdsourcing and gamification in an HCI class is, again, you need to think very carefully about what do you need everyone to do and how do you incentivize them to do it. Okay, we have half an hour left. We're going to spend the last half hour talking about a crowdsourcing project that came from my research lab. And I'm going to introduce you to the problem first, and then we're going to talk about the crowdsourcing solution that we came up with. As you know, in my group, we work on robotics. I think Nick and Sam might have talked about that a little bit last week. Robotics is interesting, lots of unsolved problems in robotics. One of them is how do you teach robots English or Spanish or Mandarin? How do you teach a robot to understand human languages? It's a very difficult thing to do. There's a theory that's been out in the field for a long time, which says that one way to teach robots language is to get them to ground the symbols of language in their sensor motor experiences. Okay, so what does that mean? Imagine we have a robot, and that robot has little touch sensors in its feet. It's got little pressure pads in its feet, and the robot can feel whenever those pressure pads are firing. The robot knows when its feet are on or off the ground. The robot runs around and does its thing, and every once in a while, whenever all the pressure pads in its feet go to 0, suddenly the robot hears out there in the world, JUMP. The robot doesn't speak English, doesn't know what JUMP means. It just knows that when it's doing its thing, when this happens, this happens. Imagine a robot is equipped with a machine learning algorithm and starts to learn that process, that sensor motor experience, the robot pushes against the world, literally with its feet, and observes how the world pushes back. All the sensors go to 0, right? it also hears these symbols. All the way at the beginning of the course, we talked about John Dewey, right? John Dewey said, if you want to understand people, you got to remember that people are active. They push against the world. The motor system is primary, and then they observe the sensory repercussion of their action. Right? In robotics, we follow John Dewey in trying to do the same thing. Now, instead of organisms, we have machines that act and sense the repercussions of their actions. And in this case, the repercussions of their action was not just pressure information dropping to 0, it was also JUMP. Okay, so if you were to take this hypothetical robot and ask it what JUMP means, what would this hypothetical robot do? It can't speak English yet. It would jump, right? It would make all of its pressure sensors go to 0. It would signal to you that it knows, quote unquote, what JUMP means. That's the theory. Okay, assuming you can get a robot to do that, to ground these symbols in pressure information, that seems like a relatively easy thing to do because JUMP is what's known as a motoric word. Motor, meaning it's sort of close to the motor system, right? So words like jump, twist, crouch, crawl, walk, run, go left, go right, those are all very motoric words. When I'm telling you those words, the motor strip in your brain starts to light up. You imagine yourself jumping, twisting, crawling, grabbing, going left, going right, and so on. But how would a robot understand a slightly less motoric word like movement? Movement can be interpreted in two ways. It can be interpreted as a motoric thing. Movement is basically a set that contains JUMP, MOVE, CROUCH, and so on and so forth. Movement is sort of something that contains all these other things. So you can imagine a robot, as it's moving around, grounds JUMP in its sensor motor experience, and then starts to ground slightly less motoric words in more motoric words. Whenever the robot does this and hears JUMP, or does something else and hears WALK, it also hears MOVE, MENT in both cases. Right? So we're imagining that there are humans that do understand English, and they are talking to the robots as the robots do things. That robot, that's jump, which is a type of movement. Robot, what you just did is called walk, and it is also a type of movement. The robot might start to be able to ground MOVE, MENT in JUMP, MOVE, and so on. If it can do that, could it ground something even more abstract like political movement and socialism and democracy and? Seems tricky, right? Seems like the robot can only get so far. Democracy seems like a very abstract word. There's no motoric equivalent of democracy, right? As I said, when I mentioned the word jump, in your motor strip, the part of your motor strip that's responsible for controlling your legs actually lights up. If we put you in a brain scanner and you heard the word jump, that part of the motor strip would light up. If we put you in a brain scanner and said the word democracy, would the motor strip light up? Doesn't seem like it.
Does it depend on maybe like contextual environments? Because if I was in like say like a movement or something, say like a political movement,
Yep.
and someone told me democracy, would my brain then light up at that point?
Maybe. This is all hypothetical at the moment. Nobody's actually done this. Is the word democracy purely abstract? Can you imagine a motor part to democracy? Arlo?
Well, it's like very intensive. What if like upon doing that, the robot ran a little simulation which simulated a bunch of robots that were trying to manage themselves?
Maybe, right? Democracy involves lots of people, or in the machine's case, maybe lots of machines.
I don't know how you tell the robot, but like a movement part of democracy would be vote.
Vote, yeah, exactly, right? One vote, one voice. Voice is getting sort of motoric. Has anybody played tug of war before? You're pulling, your team is pulling, there's too many people on the other side. They brought in a bodybuilder, they're cheating, right? You feel yourself losing the battle. You recruit another person to your team. They grab the rope. You feel them grab the rope. You start to pull everybody in your direction. Possibly. Again, this is all hypothetical. But the idea in robotics is maybe the way to teach robots language, including eventually abstract language, is to get them to find relationships between words and their own felt experiences. That's the problem. As I mentioned, it's mostly hypothetical. It's a hard thing to do. So a couple of years back in my group, we created a crowdsourcing project to try and recruit people to issue symbols or words to the robots and use a machine learning algorithm to try and find the relationships between what the crowd is saying and what the robots are feeling. Okay, that's the problem and that's the solution. I'm going to walk you through one version of this project known as the Twitch Plays Robotics project. We published a paper on this a couple years back. This was some work with Joey and Netzberger, and Joey actually took this class 4 years ago. As you'll see in a moment, there are both robotics and HCI components to this project. It's a pretty detailed experiment. We only have 25 minutes left, so I'm just going to walk you through the basic parts of this experiment. What you're going to see the robots in the Twitch Plays Robotics project do, first of all, they're going to act. They are Deweyan creatures. They're going to push against the world first and observe how the world pushes back. After they act, they're going to observe what does the crowd do in response to these robot actions. Then the robots are going to try and learn. They're going to try and learn relationships between their actions and the social response of the crowd. They're going to look for these relationships. And if they can find them, the robots are going to try and prove to us that they understand these symbols or these words by making predictions. And I'll show you how that works in a moment. Okay, so act, observe, learn, and predict. Let's start with the act part. So what we started with was to create a simulation of robots. You're going to see some virtual robots in a moment. They're running around in a physics engine that exists on a computer here on the UVM campus. We take that continuously running robot simulator and we push the video to Twitch. How many people have heard of the Twitch website? Okay, more than SETI at home. If you haven't seen twitch.tv before, go and have a look. This is a really amazing website. Millions of people go and watch millions of other people play video games. It's incredible. If you go and find the Twitch Plays Robotics channel on twitch.tv, instead of watching somebody play a video game, you're watching our robot simulator. And here's the 2016 version of it. Here's our virtual creatures over here. As I mentioned, they're acting first. In this early example and this early version of Twitch Plays Robotics, the robots were simply acting at random. And as these robots were acting, you can see on the right over here, the crowd is issuing language to the robots. So what we told the crowd when they came to Twitch Plays Robotics was to think of these robots like pets. So the game is to teach these robots to obey commands. There are a vast number of commands that these robots probably can't learn, but there is a small set of commands that these robots probably can learn, but we don't know what those commands are. That's the game. Figure out what words these robots can learn and figure out how to teach them. You'll notice that there are two different robots in the early Twitch Plays Robotics project, the simple worm robot and then the simple four-legged robot, and we'll come back to this in a moment. You'll notice that at this point, someone issued the command crawl forward. We were excited about that. That's a very motoric word. You could imagine the robots might be able to ground that word. There's another suggestion for walk forward. The crowd could type in anything they wanted. It was up to them. One of the first things we learned about this project is that people instinctually will type in motoric words without us explaining what motoricity is. So that was good news. Spin is pretty motoric. They got pretty bored of these two robots, so they wanted a new robot, or hype, whatever that means. So you can imagine this is the internet. We got all sorts of things. One person at some point commanded the robots to prove Fermat's last theorem, which so far the robots have not been able to ground. Somebody else issued the command, be yourself. First I thought, there's no way you can ground that, but then I thought, oh, maybe.
I'm just curious, how do you know that your algorithm is going to work and teach this robot successfully based on the user's response? Is that just years of practice on your part? Or?
It's a lot of this, hoping for the best. Yes, we had some intuition. So developmental psychology, the branch of psychology that studies human infants. One of the interesting findings from developmental psychology, which we'll actually talk about in 2 weeks' time, is that parents don't teach kids. Kids teach parents. Kids give off certain signals about what they can and can't learn at the current time. You're giving me too much or you're giving me too little. So little kids actually scaffold their own learning by sort of sending off signals to parents. And our pets, our domesticated animals, have evolved to sort of pull on those same circuits, right? Those of you that have dogs and cats, you probably know all the kinds of dirty tricks they pull to get your attention, to capture your attention and get stuff from you. Human children, pets do the same thing. These robots were designed to do the same thing. Hopefully all of you are instinctually feeling a need to try and teach these robots simple commands. That was one of the intuitions we drew on that this might actually work, is we're hoping that the robots will be able to pull from the crowd just the stuff that they can learn. And you can see that generally speaking, that's the case. The crowd is not issuing commands like walk to the far edge of the plane, do a backflip, look back at the camera, and then come back and nod your head 3 times. People did not type those kinds of things in because most people would realize that's probably too difficult for the robots. We are instinctual parents and teachers. You have a bit of a sense of what these things are capable of learning and what they're not capable of learning. So far, so good? Question?
So people enter walk forward
Yes.
randomly at any point?
At any point. And as you can see from the video, when you issue a command, at any point, it basically goes up here in the voting box. So you're sort of voting on what you want to try and teach the robots next. There's 12 votes for walk forward. So now walk forward becomes the new command issued to the crowd. And now you can start to vote on what you want to try and teach the robot next, which will be issued to the crowd, or issued to the robots in another 165 seconds. So every 3 minutes or so, a new command is issued to the robots, and everyone votes on what that command is going to be. Margaret. Doesn't look like it's improving at the moment, right? In this early version, the robots are not learning online. They're all just moving randomly, and they're pulling stuff out of the crowd. And you probably know by now what kind of stuff they're pulling out of the crowd. Training data, right? So they're acting at this point. They're acting, and in a moment I'm going to explain observe and learn. The machine learning algorithm is going to come into play. At the moment, the robots are just performing randomly, and the crowd is responding. So we're collecting all the chat that's coming back from the Twitch website and storing it in a database. So far, so good? Okay. Okay, so what does this data set look like? All right, so not unlike the data set that you were working with in deliverable 6 and 7. We have 2 robots, R0 and R1. R0 is the worm robot. R1 is the 4-legged robot. For each one of these robots, it heard a whole bunch of different commands. Jump, walk, be yourself, prove Fermat's last theorem, all sorts of things. A whole set of alphanumeric strings which are encoded in the C's. So for every R, there is a set of strings, which are the commands that that robot heard, that was issued to the robot. For each one of those commands, it's a little hard to see here, this is CIJ. It means the Jth command that was issued to the ith robot. Under that command was issued to the robot for however long it was issued. And as the robot heard that command, it performed a number of actions. And those actions were generated by a controller. For our purposes, just think of the controller as the thing in the brain of the robot, the thing that causes the robot to perform actions. So you can think about N for controller or actions, doesn't really matter for our purposes. So we have the worm robot. It heard, for example, the command JUMP. And under the command JUMP, it did this, then it did this, then it did this, and then it did this. One simulation after another. For each one of those simulations, for each one of those actions, people could then type in, yes, the robot is JUMPing, or no, that robot is not JUMPing. So for each one of these actions or these controllers, we collect how many no votes did you get, which is, for our purposes, S sub 0 here, and how many thumbs up did that action get, S sub 1. So far, so good? So that's the data set. We have 2 robots, a whole bunch of commands, a whole bunch of actions that these robots performed under those commands, and for each one of those actions, we got some thumbs up and some thumbs down. That's the data set. Okay, so that's the observation part here. You can think of that as the robots observing or collecting all of this stuff back from the crowd. Okay. Here's that video again. I've just sped it up a fair bit so you can see how this works. Whole bunch of actions. You can see commands being issued to the robot. And then if you look down here now, this command walk forward, those were 5 no votes, 1 no vote, a couple of yes votes. So each command, each action is collecting a bunch of these yes and no votes. So far, so good? Okay. So what did we actually collect? Here's all the data that we got. We ran this for a couple of days. We had 424 people participate. During that time, there were 57,000 actions or evaluations that were performed, 57,000 of these simulations. Most of these simulations were occurring in the middle of the night and there was no one on the stream, so there was no thumbs up and thumbs down being collected. So out of those 57,000 actions, there were around 6,400 actions that got at least 1 thumbs up or at least 1 thumbs down. We got 16,000 pieces of chat. We got all sorts of bad words and all the other things that people love to do on the internet. We had 9,000 commands entered. Most of those were repeats. So when we stripped out the repeats, there were 266 different commands issued to the robots. The most popular command was JUMP, and that was issued 385 times to the robot, followed by walk forward, move forward, run, crawl forward. So we were excited to see that the 5 most popular commands were short and very motoric. These are things that there's a good chance that the robots actually will be able to learn. The crowd had issued proof for Matt's last theorem hundreds of times and provided positive and negative reinforcements. We were probably going to be out of luck. So with the instructions that we gave to the crowd, at least the crowd is doing what they're supposed to be doing. The humans are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Can the robots reciprocate? Okay. We got 7,500 thumbs up and thumbs down in total. We won't worry about the statistics here. We'll just focus on this last one here, which is O. This is the proportion of positive reinforcement. So 0 would have been all of those 7,500 were no votes. If we had gotten O of 1, that would have been all yes votes. We got 0.28, which means 28% of the reinforcements were positive, and the rest, the 72%, were no votes. So most of the votes were no votes, which kind of makes sense. The robots are moving randomly. They're usually not going to be doing whatever the crowd has commanded them to do. So far, so good? Okay. Okay, so now we finished the action part, the observation part. How are the robots actually going to learn? And I think I better zoom in on this so you can see a little bit better. We took all of the robots that received reinforcement, so remember that there were 6,400 of these actions, 6,400 of these actions that got some reinforcement. We played them back now on the physics engine. We turned off the Twitch streaming. For each one of those 6,400 actions, we generated a two-dimensional matrix that you see here of touch information. So if you look carefully, you'll see there's a bunch of zeros and ones. You'll see that there are 3 columns. These 3 columns correspond to the 1, 2, 3 parts that make up the worm robot. In each of these 3 sections, there is a pressure pad. And when that piece of the worm touches the ground, that pressure pad fires, and there's a 1. When that piece of the worm is off the ground, that pressure pad is 0. So each column here is recording sensor data from the robot, and each row is corresponding to an instant of time in the robot. So in this cartoon example here, in the first time step of the robot's life, its midsection was on the ground, but its head and tail were off the ground. At the next time instant, its head was off the ground, its midsection was touching the ground, and its tail was touching the ground, and so on. So this is the result of the robot's action. We have a matrix, and that matrix corresponds to one number, and that one number is O. What was the fraction of yeses and nos that the robot got in response to that action under that command?
Did you give a weight to yes, so like yeses as opposed to nos? Like, were people more likely to give negative or positive reinforcement?
It's complete democracy here. One vote is one vote. That's it. Okay, so we now have 6,400 of these matrices, and for each one of these matrices, we have a single number, the fraction of yeses and nos. So far, so good? Okay, let's try and end this lecture by sort of visualizing what this data set looks like. It's a big data set, so we're going to just look at the worm robot for the moment, and we're going to look at all the actions that the worm robot performed when the crowd issued JUMP. I picked JUMP for a reason, okay? And there's several hundred actions here that it performed. Each dot here corresponds to one of those actions. And the horizontal position of the point was the fraction of time or proportion of time that the robot stayed grounded, meaning that at least one of the touch sensors, or at least one of those pressure pads, equaled 1. If there was a point in time in which all 3 pressure pads were reporting 0, then that means that the robot was not grounded. It was off the ground. Yeah? So we're taking all of that pressure information over the lifetime of the robot and collapsing that matrix down into just a single floating point number, right? Fraction of time that the robot spent on the ground. The further to the right the point is, the more time the robot spent on the ground. The further to the left the point is, the less time the robot spent on the ground. Okay. The vertical position of every point is the crowd's response to that action under the command JUMP. In this case, we've normalized that value O to range between -1 and +1 because it makes it easier to think about. A dot that has -1 means unanimous no votes. So this particular action might have got 1 no vote, or 2 no votes, or 10 no votes. Doesn't matter. A value of 0 means there was a split vote, 2 thumbs up and 2 thumbs down, or 7 thumbs up, 7 thumbs down. And a value of 1 means unanimous positive reinforcement. Unanimous thumbs up. Okay, there's all the actions that the worm robot performed under JUMP. Does the robot understand now what JUMP? Has the robot grounded the symbols JUMP in its own experiences? See a lot of nods of the head. Not very well. If you're a statistician, you would know that this is a pretty messy data set. However, if you try and fit a straight line so that that straight line is as close to as many dots as possible, you get this dotted line that has a negative slope. It's not a very good fit to the data because this dashed line is pretty far from most of the points. But no matter how you fit this line, you always get this negative slope. What does the negative slope tell the robot?
It tells the robot that the less time spent grounded, the more reinforcement is going to get.
Exactly. So if you now ask the worm robot, what does JUMP mean? It doesn't jump. It gives you back this line. It gives you back M and B, the slope and the y-intercept of this line. The robot says, this is what JUMP means. It means that there's an anti-correlation between this thing, this experience I got, and how the crowd felt about it. So far, so good? Okay, that's the worm robot. Here's the legged robot under the exact same command, JUMP. These are all the actions that the legged robot performed when the crowd issued JUMP. What does JUMP mean to this robot?
Approximately the same thing. It has a negative slope.
Approximately the same thing. It has a negative slope, but a very different y-intercept. So this is kind of interesting because it means, first of all, that JUMP means something to both of these robots. They have a limited understanding of JUMP. It's not great, but it's a start. And it's different for both robots. Yeah? Okay. So it's learned this relationship. We're going to end now with a prediction. Let's imagine that the robot is standing still, or it's playing by itself, and the robot does something and realizes that this particular robot realizes it spent half the time on the ground. The robot is not exposed to a crowd. There's no humans around. What do you think the robot would think if it was seen by humans? What does the robot predict the crowd will do?
Positive reinforcement.
Positive reinforcement. So if you follow the line up here and across about here, and the robot would tell you, I think that if people saw me doing this, I'd get 30%, I'd get more yes votes than no votes. What happens if the robot does something and spends 100% of its time on the ground, which it has never done, something that has never been seen by the crowd? What does the crowd predict? What does the robot predict the crowd will say about this? Unanimous negative reinforcement. So this robot is not very bright, doesn't understand a lot of things, but it understands the beginnings of the English language, and it has a mental model of the crowd. Remember our discussion about mental models. This robot can take this mental model and make predictions about social responses to its actions. All of the autonomous cars that are out there right now do not have this. Autonomous cars are sociopaths. They're not evil. They don't know about people. They don't care about people. They don't care if people get hurt. An autonomous car cannot predict for a given action how people will respond if people were watching the autonomous car perform that action. Part of the application of this work is in the domain now of AI safety, making machines safe by making them be able to construct mental models and use them to predict how people will feel about the machine's actions. I think that's a good place to end for today. You have a quiz due tonight, and we'll talk about Deliverable 8 on Thursday. Thank you.